Another episode of With the Chiefs.
Wait. Man, I need more rest.
I hope I've got your last name right there.
It's a very good pronunciation.
You should know better than that now, Dom.
I know.
All right, well, welcome back. We're lucky to be joined again by Sally, Coach Sally.
In person this time.
Which
Yeah.
is
How
good.
good is this?
Yeah. we've got a little light here. See if that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hopefully we don't look too spooky. There's a few shadows going on, but yeah. Maybe we'll. I was saying before we just already talked about training. We recorded 2 days ago, so we'll give it a go. Maybe we'll talk a little bit in the future as well. But yeah. What's been going on with you in terms of training?
What's been going with me? Oh, I just got back actually. I managed to get up to the Sunshine Coast for the weekend, sort of a 4-day weekend, which is great. I think actually probably the last time I was on, I just signed up for Black Hole 100. So figured I should actually maybe check out the course, see if I like it.
Where's that one?
So it's sort of Sunshine Coast out near Mapleton. So there's a big state forest out there. And yeah, friends of friends had a place about 40-minute drive from the start line and all of those trails. So yeah, it was really good actually. I've been feeling quite good sort of with my running at the moment and got some good weather and really enjoyed. So it seems like a really nice balance of some not too technical single track and then a lot of quite runnable sort of fire trail road based stuff. And it's not too crazy in terms of overall elevation. I sort of got eyes on about 50 k's of the course, so yeah, I feel like I've got a bit of a better feel for that now, which is always nice. I think when you're going into bigger races, if you've managed to get a bit of an idea of what you're up for and what the checkpoints kind of look like, but I think it's broken down quite well into legs. Like I think it's going to be quite easy to compartmentalize, and it's like 8.6 k's to here and then another 11 k's to there, and just sort of tick through them and see how you go.
Yeah.
So yeah, that was sort of been most of my training the last week. Was meant to go for a run this afternoon, but the day got away and I get to talk about running now instead. So that's training, isn't it?
It's certainly a version of it.
Yeah.
But Dom, you mentioned getting out on the course.
Yeah,
makes a big difference compared because
absolutely, yeah. It's like one of my biggest fears is like getting lost, and I feel like if I haven't done the course, it's always just on my mind like, am I going the right way? Am I going the right way?
Because in a lot of those races, I mean, I think you and I probably might come at different ends of the spectrum in terms of being on our own. It's because you're going so fast and so I'm not. But yeah, I think like navigation is a big part of particularly trail stuff. Even when the course is marked, like I've done it myself. I've marked a lot of courses, and the number of arrows that people will run through is incredible when they're at the tail end of ultra marathons. So yeah, I think sort of having your wits about you is important. Having some idea of geography and the layout and general directions and things is always going to be pretty important. But I think psychologically too, I guess it depends what you're after. I think there'd be maybe some attraction to literally rocking up to a start line and having no idea what any of it looks like, and it's just one big surprise.
It sounds like probably one of my worst nightmares.
Which I think is interesting to unpack sometimes too. But I think where I'm at right now, I'm quite glad I've got a bit more of an idea of the actual course.
Yeah.
And I think it's easier for me to bond with the longer training when I know that there's trails I'm looking forward to running again on the course.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What kind of training do you have planned?
It's all, I guess it's all been pretty up in the air. I had a really good block, so I was fortunate enough to get over to Switzerland for a couple of weeks, which is amazing. So did some altitude training in Samaritz and had some coaching opportunities over there, which was awesome. So I feel like there's been a nice sort of lead up to this weekend, and then on Friday I get on a plane and go to Glasgow to present at a conference for
not a running conference.
Not a running conference, no, it's for my PhD research stuff. I'm desperately hoping I'm not as knocked around by the jet lag from these flights as I was from the Switzerland flights, because I probably don't have that much time to take a week off because I'm super jet lagged. But hopefully, so friends that are also attending the conference are also ultra runners, and one's just finished TDS over at UTMB and is pulling up okay. We've hired a car and we're going to go check out some of the coastal trails in northern England for a couple of days at the end of the conference. So I'm hoping I can get sort of a good 50, 60k over 2 days kind of done before I jump back on a plane. So we'll see.
When's that race?
Blackall's mid-October.
Okay.
Yeah. So
it's a bit after Melbourne.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's the weekend after Melbourne, I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was going to say I'll switch to coaching, but I don't know what I'm doing. It's like I'll try and
tips, Luke.
No. I'll send you text. Good luck. Have fun out there. Looking good. That's the extent of me being useful, but anyway.
Yeah. I think the main thing that I'm finding hard to fit in at the moment is I do usually like to do a lot more strength work, and I've been doing some kettlebell stuff at home, but actually physically getting to a gym at the moment when I've been travelling a lot has been quite difficult. But we'll see.
Yeah. Okay.
How about you guys? Well, how about you, Dom? I know what this is. You did a race, didn't you? Didn't you?
Yeah, I did.
End up on a podium or something, but you probably just discussed that.
Yeah, Dubbo, it was pretty good. It's good fun. Good to be back racing. I've missed that. But this week I've actually been roped into some of Smitty's training. So
9:30 with me.
So
what were you meant to do?
I was meant to do an hour in strides, and I just ended up jumping in with Smitty. But I'm sure, I don't know.
Company's good.
It'll be alright. Yeah. So we did that on Tuesday. Yep. I took Monday off after the race.
Yeah.
And then today's meant to be a long run, but I haven't done that yet. Maybe after this I'll get out.
Maybe you and I need to get out.
How long is the long run meant to be?
It's meant to be an hour and 40.
Okay.
Yeah.
But,
it's 6:14 p.m. right now.
That's all right. Doesn't it?
Get into it.
Yeah. Good training.
Yeah. Because what's the goal? Have you sort of reset?
So like UTA is the next kind of big one.
Yeah.
And I signed up with Tim and Michaela.
Awesome.
So it's good to have a bit of guidance. But yeah,
no, these guys are awesome.
Yeah, and then tomorrow I think it's like an hour, and then Friday another session which is 6 by 5 minutes. And then Saturday, I think it's just like an easy run, an hour or something. And Sunday's a big long run. I think it's 3.5 hours. So,
yeah, awesome.
Yeah.
Are you going to try and get out on trail?
Yeah. I think, I don't know, have you been up to the Blue Mountains, or do you know if any tracks are open?
That's exactly, like I haven't had a weekend in Sydney where I've had time or a car, because life's been annoying at the moment. But I know a few are sort of getting out there again, but I actually personally haven't had eyes on those trails since the last barrage of floods and landslips and stuff. I haven't sort of been keeping too close tabs on it, to be honest, whether how confident they are at getting their course off the ground. And can you drive to Narrowneck yet, or is that road still caved away?
Yeah, I don't even know. It seems like it's not something you can just fix up overnight. Like,
no.
Yeah. So we'll see what happens.
Yeah.
But that's my week in a nutshell.
Yeah. What are the you were doing 5-minute efforts. What's the intensity meant to be? Yeah,
so kind of like half marathon sort of effort.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
So not too hard.
Is there much of that sort of stuff in the program?
I think like there won't really be too much fast stuff. It'll pretty much just be all half marathon kind of work.
Yep.
I guess trying to build that threshold, or I'm not too sure.
What do you tend to, for the longer stuff, do you do anything short, like faster? Anything VO2 max or?
I'm probably not at the pointy end of build. Like I tend to sort of like to do that work earlier on, so sort of balancing out higher intensity stuff with some just long, slow kind of base building stuff. I think it's still important to have some intensity in there, but I probably tend to structure that more as sort of hill sprint stuff. I just think that builds a little bit more strength and sort of better biomechanics sometimes as well, and it's sort of easier to it's probably easier to convince trail running people in general to run up a hill fast than to run at a track fast. But yeah, I think, you know, it is important to kind of be getting as many of your long runs on sort of race simulated terrain. So even if it's not the exact course, trying to find sort of some trails that are going to give you a similar kind of cumulative elevation. I think it's pretty important. But I think it depends a lot on the course. Like UTA, depending on which course they end up with, lots of that is very runnable, and I think it's important to sort of be practicing, you know, what sort of intensity is sustainable from a pacing perspective over the more runnable things, because I think the trap with particularly the first half of that course is it's probably too runnable, that you're more likely to go out hard, and then I guess practicing hiking as well. So for some of the other ultras that I'll coach people for that are a lot more sort of climbing and really technical kind of high country sort of stuff, then we need to practice that, and often I'll be prescribing hiking hill reps rather than necessarily running long stuff. So I think it depends a lot on the actual specifics of the race and the demands of the race.
Yeah, that makes sense. Certainly not a land I want to delve into.
I reckon
not yet.
Yeah, we might have no.
Well, we have a 5 or 10 year plan.
Yeah, I reckon every now and then a little bit of trails might be good for you. I
don't know. Maybe I haven't really tried it, so
exactly.
Maybe I'll enjoy it.
It's good to mix up surfaces and sort of mix up the terrain that you're sort of training on. So, maybe there could be some shorter trails that might be fun to target once we've sort of ticked off another road marrow or two.
Yeah.
What about your week, Smitty?
My week, I can't remember when did we record?
I think it was Monday night.
Okay, so we've got one session to talk about. So Monday, easy 45. Tuesday, how did we go, Dom? I went out, I think, so just for context, the session was 2x30. Would you say that pace is meant to be marathon pace, or it's not really defined as...
It's sort of definitely in the ballpark, I guess. I tend to find that I tend to like to train people to around 90% of their lactate threshold, so their functional threshold, as a pitch for marathon pace. I think, we've had a couple of weeks with some disruption and things as well, so I was kind of keen to see what your heart rate data and stuff was doing at that
high
intensity. Yeah, still a little bit higher. It's not as bad as some of the last week stuff where you push it a bit. So, and I think, coming back from COVID, it's quite a dance, and I think everyone's recovery and experience of illness is quite varied. Certainly, a lot of the people I was coaching, including myself, got COVID more at that Christmas sort of wave that hit, and I feel like that really knocked people around a lot more, including myself. I just had no energy for at least sort of 3-4 weeks. I wasn't really able to get back into anything more than a 20-minute easy kind of run, and easy did not feel easy. Whereas, I know other people that literally felt fine after a week and have raced, 50k races 2 weeks after and done fine. Whereas obviously, Dom, you sort of probably experience that, maybe you're just not quite where you think you are until you start testing it, and it's that extra gear just isn't there yet still. And
absolutely.
You just don't, suffering through that isn't going to be productive. So I think we're still, this is kind of your first week back to more kind of full volume. And I was pretty keen to keep all of that below threshold.
Well, it was good. but I think I went out a little bit quick. Like,
Yeah.
you can kind of tell. I feel marathon pace is a bit of an awkward in between.
Mm.
I think that's why you got to practice it. Too.
Yeah. It's weird.
Yeah.
It's like, still running obviously quite hard, but not reaching that threshold where you start to feel like it's intense.
Yeah.
Yeah, I felt like towards like the back of the first rep, we probably pushed it a bit too much. Like we should just let the pace drop and just go into feel.
Yeah.
And then that kind of cooked us for the next rep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the first rep felt good towards the end, and then kind of a little bit worried that because you got another 30 minutes, but a lot of it's mental. Like you can kind of
it's
hold
a long
that
time.
pace if
Yeah.
you're below threshold is what I'm learning.
Yeah.
At least, but it feels like, oh my god, this is quick.
Yeah.
But it's not sometimes.
Yeah.
Which is interesting.
Yeah, and I think there's so much that goes into training for, any event, whether it's a marathon or a 5K or an ultra. It's getting your head in the game as much as your legs and your fitness. And, I think that's what I enjoy unpacking sometimes with my athletes too.
Yeah. Which we have. I don't think I can do this.
Yeah, you can.
Like looking at the program and seeing like 9x2K and being like,
Oh my god.
I don't know
Fire.
until it's
Yeah.
just one rep at a
Just
time.
one at a time. You absolutely could do that session, and you do.
Yeah.
And I think it's knowing your athlete, and that's why I'm particularly interested in developing those sort of longer term coaching relationships rather than just tap in for sort of a race. I think getting to know how an individual actually responds to particular sessions and what they find to grind versus what they find exciting is quite diverse.
Yeah.
And changes within that individual depending on what else is going on too. And I think it was interesting, we did finally get a week where your motivation waned a little bit and we didn't sort of wait.
We did a whole podcast episode.
I may have been stacking you a bit harder to see where that
I knew it!
No,
Well, you broke me.
but I guess it's just interesting to sort of see what where you were at psychologically as well. Like you'd had a really, really consistent block. You'd had a great race at Gold Coast and had essentially a 2-week reset. But we're all kind of different, and again it depends on how many other things are up in the air and what kind of stress that's applying to your overall kind of life as well. I think when life stress picks up in a particular area, your desire to suffer during training often goes down, and I think when there's stress at work or stress with sort of family stuff, we need to be aware of that. And I think I really enjoy coaching athletes like yourself who are quite open about where they're at. This is hard this week and I'm not sure why, and we can sort of unpick that at the time. Because I think those stresses are important to accommodate for in terms of overall training load as well. If I know that someone's under a lot of pressure and they're working stupid hours or there's a lot of emotional stress going on for them in their private life, there's no point flogging them in training, or it's not going to end well for their long-term health. And I think that's the really hard one to quantify. I obviously like data in general about things, but that's only one part of the coaching for me. And I think it's finding other ways to monitor and quantify that level of stress and integrating that into a program that means we can still sort of move towards a goal, but we're not overloading people and waiting for something to break, because often there's so many reasons why we run, but generally we do it because we enjoy it. And if we push too hard in those times and then get injured and can't run and life sucks in all of those other areas, then it just all really sucks.
Absolutely.
It's trying to minimize those speed bumps, which I've hit plenty personally anyway, so
it's interesting. I think when was it? It was a few weeks ago when I got so used to doing like Monday easy-ish, Tuesday like go hard.
Yeah.
Wednesday, easy-ish. And there was a breakup, and then obviously training for the marathon, you started adding in a bit more in the middle.
Yeah.
And I think it just cracked me.
Yeah,
but
it was like a tempo. There was more tempo for
it wasn't
the
like
Wednesday
hard.
and the Friday. No, you weren't going that hard, and you could absolutely do it. But it, and I think that's what we both learn in that coach-athlete sort of relationship. That's the first time you'd verbalized to me that actually Monday, Wednesday and Friday easy running is just, I'd gotten used to that being my chill out, tap out from work, down regulate. And that's important information, and particularly in weeks where life stress is higher, those runs become even more valuable.
Yeah.
So, it's not like I'm going to be setting you tempo runs 7 days a week long term at all. I guess it was always going to be a bit of a bigger build, just sort of getting back into marathon sort of training.
Yeah, absolutely.
You've got the sort of chronic training load, and you've got the endurance to handle it, but it's just sort of finding that balance in that particular week.
Well, I couldn't tell if it was stuff was going on and I could have just stuck with it, or that it was kind of a blurry in between. You know what I mean? And
I think you get to know yourself the more you go along this journey as well. And I think, making, as I'm a big advocate for leaving sort of notes at the end of training sessions. Yep. So I deliver programs through a platform called Training Peaks, and so at the end of the workout you can sort of rate how you felt with a little smiley face scale.
Leaving my notes. Sometimes they're an essay, I'm like,
and okay, that's great. That's great. Like it's great for me, but I've been doing it as an athlete myself now for 4 or 5 years on that platform, and I can literally look back and go, oh, how was I feeling leading into UTA that many years ago, and go, oh yeah, I felt shit here too. Like, you sort of start to, it gives you an ability to be a bit more objective looking back through your own data. And I think for anyone out there that's training a lot and isn't necessarily being coached, I think it's really important to be leaving notes about your mood and your willingness to train, and what's coming up for you during those runs. I think is really interesting too, like what are the barriers that you're creating for yourself, why you can't finish a session, and keeping notes on those, because I think the trends that I'm always looking out for, if we're seeing sort of some sad faces cropping up at the end of each session, or it's like that was really hard, and I'm like, well, the intensity actually wasn't that hard, and the way you executed it wasn't that hard relative to what your potential is. So there's something amiss. Like, are you eating, are you sleeping, like what else is going on? And I think being able to be your own judge of that is really hard unless you've got objective data to look back through. I think we're our own worst enemies in terms of trying to actually track how we're recovering a lot of the time. And
it's interesting.
I think that's like a pretty good point as to why it's good to have a coach as well, because like I feel like I'd do a similar thing when I was coaching myself, but I kind of had these expectations about how the session should go already, and I was kind of just rating it to that. So I was pretty much always just rating myself a 7 or an 8 because I'd already said, okay, this is the session, this is how I'm going to feel. Like I really took all that into account.
Decided that, this is realistic, yes, I can do it, and this is the goal that I want at the end of it. So this needs to feel good, so it's going to.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's like, is it though? So I think it is really hard, and particularly when we've been in training for a long time. I think that insidious sort of fatigue, if we're not actually giving ourselves time to recover from each race, and I think it's something I'm not going to pretend that I've figured out the perfect solution, because I think I fall into that trap too. But running's become such a popular sport, and there's a lot more events sort of now that we're, touch wood, hopefully through all of the lockdowns and things. It's really, I think there could be merit in actually structuring more of an annual season. I think it's really easy to fall into this trap of, well, I've ticked off that race, and I've had a week of just training to feel, and I feel pretty good, so what's next? And signing up for the next thing, and then signing up for the next thing. And the longer those races get, particularly once you're doing marathons or 50Ks or 100Ks, I think the more distorted your lens gets on how much those events take to recover truly, and it's not just your musculoskeletal system. It's not just that, oh well, I don't have DOMS anymore and I can run without pain. It's where's your central nervous system and your hormonal system, and where are all of those systems at in terms of recovery. And I think those really long runs like 100Ks and milers, can really take a couple of months to fully equilibrate after that. And most people have already done the next race within that time frame.
Yeah.
And you sort of like, oh, it's just a marathon.
What's the deal with the marathon taking so much longer it's like you go to this extra compared to a half marathon, for example. It just completely, I remember running my first marathon and just like felt like I wasn't back for over a month.
Yeah, I think anything that's stretching out above that sort of 1.5, 2 hours where you're working hard the whole time, the longer that goes, I think, the more you're digging deep. And I think your first one always probably takes a bit longer. A lot of the time, it's usually the first time you've pushed yourself that hard for that long.
Yeah.
I do think you obviously with consistency and years of racing, you do develop more resilience to that sort of stuff. But I think it's just a function of you are literally sort of on that tightrope line of not blowing up and pushing just hard enough, and it just takes recovery. But it's hard to gauge, and I think again that's where having someone else to bounce things off, and whether that's a coach or a training partner that's got maybe a bit more running experience than you do, or a physio, like I think you can have a lot of people in your corner, but you need to, I guess, be keeping a bit of information about what you're doing to then be able to be objective about what's next and how to plan for that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, before I started getting coaching, before the podcast, I was starting to get like low motivation because I'd been coaching myself for, I don't know, not coaching, doing my own program and stuff like that. And it just gets really repetitive.
Yeah.
And then you realise, hang on, I probably don't have to do this on my own.
Yeah. And I personally, I'm someone that enjoys being part of a team as well. Like, if I'm really gearing up for something, I do enjoy sort of having a coach or someone else that I can be accountable with, but also just be, using as a little bit of a gauge of, is what I'm doing still on track. And I think working with a bit of, that feeling of having a team behind you in what is essentially quite a solo, lonely sport is quite valuable.
It makes all the difference.
Yeah.
I honestly was planning on probably just taking a step back from running before, because it's just monotonous after a while. Because half the things are the relationships you sort of build from running. I find at least, like, if, for example, with Dom, if I wasn't training with Dom, like for the previous marathons, it would, I don't know, it's just hard to train that hard.
Yeah. It is. And I think, that's where having sort of run crews and stuff can be really important too. I think, a lot of us have, a lot of work commitments and things. It's not always conducive to being able to show up for group sessions, but I think being part of that broader community, I think that's one of the massive advantages of social media, is being able to sort of feel connected even if we're not. And I think that's something that Turbo does brilliantly. The community he built through the pandemic was exclusively all of us running on our own, but sort of being able to share in that experience. So I think there's different levels of that sort of camaraderie and being able to find someone that's targeting a similar time and distance to sort of hit out those final long runs can be really valuable. Having, a group that's there when you need to do some speed work at an oval when it's still dark and cold in the morning can definitely be quite motivating. But, I think sometimes too, there's flip sides to everything, and I think if you're exclusively group training, the risk there is more that you get sucked into everyone else's paces or goals, and it can sort of pull away from your own training specificity, and you're probably a bit more likely to get sucked into running too fast for sessions, or going too long, or doing an extra session. And I think that needs a bit of monitoring as well, which is where having a coach or someone that's kind of looking at the overall picture.
Yeah.
You know what I would have done on Sunday if I... We'll talk about that in a minute. But, yeah, even when we did the session last week with Dom and Tobias, the second rep was a bit quick, and I had to like... it was almost like I was taming my ego.
You did well then, yeah.
I stuck back, and I was proud of myself. I just wanted to like... You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But I was looking at the thing, I'm like, no, I'm just going to blow up. Because I had another 15 minutes after that.
Yeah.
So I felt proud of myself just for not doing it. But it's really hard in the group environment. You do just want to go with... And because it's fun.
Yeah.
Well.
Yeah, it is.
That's the thing.
And there's definitely a time and a place for it. And I think, knowing that that's your sort of... or what tends to happen to you in that environment can be really powerful too, because when you do have a hard session that you're needing to reach a bit for, that could be a great opportunity to jump in with people that tend to run a bit quicker, or on race day that there is that extra gear that you can sort of tap into, which it's just getting to know yourself. Whereas some people find group running really intimidating, and showing up to a group of people that run faster than them is their worst nightmare. So I think it's just sort of finding the what works for you.
Yeah, I think I'll join more of the Delta sessions. They were really fun, but not for 2x30.
That's a lot of circles
around overlives, and kind of thinking probably better to simulate like the road.
Yeah, and that's it. Like, I think, it is important to mix up surfaces. I think doing some grass running, doing some track stuff, doing some road stuff, doing, trails if that's your bend, is important. But again, like, leading into the pointier end of a build, the surface specificity is just as important as the distance and the pace. If you're not conditioning your legs, like, mate, running on, doing a hard road marathon right now would leave me very sore. But doing a trail marathon, I'm probably actually going to recover a lot better from that. So it just depends on, that goal and integrating that specificity on all levels. And, that comes down to also simulating your hydration, nutrition, strategy. And
that's something I haven't been great at, because I remember telling before the half marathon, been like, I didn't take many gels or practice nutrition.
But you still sort of experimented with the modern gel for Gold Coast, and I think that worked really well for you. I think most of us, if you've been running for long enough, will have had that one race where you tried that thing that really didn't work. Usually that's motivation enough to go, I'm just going to practice this again. Let's try something else.
Have you had many of those experiences?
Mate, yeah. that was my undoing UTA. The second time I think I'd attempted it, I ended up hitting definitely the worst gut issues I've ever had.
Really?
Like, I came into Aquatic Centre feeling amazing. Like, I came up Nellie's Glen and was like, this is great.
How far in is that?
So Aquatic Centre is 56 k's. And by then you're hitting, you're heading down to Echo Point and the giant staircase, and you're down on the forest floor and doing the staircase section. And it was getting dark and cold, and as I walked out of Aquatic Centre, I'm like, it feels so great. And by the time I got to the bottom of the giant staircase, I was already like throwing up and drowning and couldn't keep anything down, and I think it took me 3.5 hours to go that 10 k's to get back out to come up to Fairmont. And as soon as I got up, whatever that staircase sort of climb is, the wind had picked up and I just couldn't stay warm. Like, I had all my stuff on and I started passing out and ended up fainting in someone's front yard, and every time I stood up I threw up and fell over again.
Far out. That's brutal, yeah.
So I ended up in a hospital tent for a few hours.
Sounds like a night out for me.
What's annoying though is, I think it comes down to two, like, there's so many things that can go exponentially wrong over the course of a ultramarathon, particularly in, more exposed environments with changeable conditions. You don't know how your physiology is going to respond on that particular day, but then out on top of that, environmental changes like temperature drops and winds and all of that sort of thing. You can't predict what's going to happen, and I think that's what I find alluring about ultras is, you can do all the training and put yourself in the best position to perform, but at the end of the day, if you don't enjoy the game of problem solving, then you're not going to last very long in ultras. And I've learnt a lot of things the hard way. I think in terms of what actually went wrong for me on that day, it was probably an intensity thing. Like, I thought I was going out at a pretty sustainable pace, but in hindsight, I think I need to sort of be a little bit better paced through the first half of ultras. My guts are a bit of a weak point for me at the best of times. And then, I'd practiced everything I ate that day, but I think for me, hard food just needs to go out the window after the first few hours. I just do better on liquid nutrition and really simple sugars. But it's annoying because, UTA, you've got a massive cutoff, and after a couple of hours at the hospital tent with a few injections of antiemetics and a lot of hot blankets and things, by 11 o'clock that night, I actually felt fine. And I think it's important when you're sort of signing up for events like that you can try and reduce the amount of external pressures on you to achieve a particular time. So for me, I was still based in Melbourne. I had a vet practice down there. I had to be on a plane by midday the next day and had to work sort of the next week solid 12-hour shifts because my sister was getting married the following weekend back up in the Blue Mountains. So I had to be back on a plane. I had to be functional to be like a bridesmaid, help my sister out. And I think all of that stuff was in the back of my mind. And I've done this done in one go. Whereas now, if I could have sort of gotten warm on the side of the trail or limped my way to Fairmont, I would have sat it out for a few hours and just let everything settle and then gone again. But you live and learn.
Yeah.
So yes, I've had gut issues. That wasn't the best time either.
Yeah. It's crazy.
That's scary.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned intensity because it's what I guess your gut's just not getting enough.
Yeah, so I guess anytime we're running at higher intensity, where does the blood flow need to be? It needs to be in our muscles to help sort of keep us moving forward. And, it's that sympathetic nervous system sort of balance. If you're, really sympathetically driven for a long time, which is what happens when you're running, the blood supply, shuts down a little bit more to what your body deems to be non-essential, so your gastrointestinal tract. So if we go back to evolution perspective, when do you need to run? Usually it's when you're running away from something or trying to catch something to eat. So the actual digesting of the food is less important in those situations. We're dickheads that go and try and stretch that out for 14 hours, 18 hours, 24 hours. So I think the longer that you're sort of applying that higher level of intensity, the more risk you are of sort of gut stasis as well. Your gut just doesn't do the normal squeezy, move everything through because it's not the priority in your system at the time. And so if you keep putting things in your stomach and nothing's moving out, everything just sort of sits there and turns around and comes back out again. But I think there's a lot more. Monash University have been doing a lot of really good research into gut issues in ultra marathons. I was sort of part of one of their trials. Didn't help. But I think your actual lining of your gastrointestinal tract starts to really suffer. The cells actually start to break down and stuff too, because you just don't have the blood supply, but also you get more sort of lactate and stuff building up as well, which is irritant. So there's lots of different reasons why you're more likely to have gut issues when you're running or doing endurance things for long periods of time. But I think given that that's already a bit of a weak point for me, when I did UTA last year, I went out with a very conservative plan. It was just purely to kind of get through it and have a good day and had a really great day out. So I think I'm curious to see where Blackhole kind of takes me in terms of intensity versus being able to continue to eat and nutrition strategies. I feel like I still haven't figured out the 100k distance, whereas 50k's I quite enjoy hitting 50s hard, and I feel like you can race 50s a bit more consistently. You've got some idea of what your physiology is likely to do in that time frame. But with hundreds, there's just so many variables that can influence that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Just so exciting.
What's
What's going to go wrong now?
Not making a compelling case for switching to
Is
that
it going to be
distance.
history or
Yeah.
hypernutrient?
Oh my god!
Stir.
Why not all of it? Shit. Alright, road marathons are the way to go for the moment.
I think you can still mess yourself up properly doing
Oh, yeah.
a hard road marathon, don't get me wrong. But, yeah.
So, do you see similar issues in marathon, or is it normally well past?
I think environmental conditions can be a massive thing that still unravel you for a marathon. I think it can be hit and miss for Gold Coast. There's been some years where it's been quite hot and humid, and historically I've been based more in Melbourne, so coming from a Melbourne winter and then hitting 26 degrees and 95% humidity, lots of people come unstuck if they've not been able to simulate race environment. And I think particularly if you're traveling for events, it's really important to sort of get a feeling for what the environmental conditions are likely to be, and try and simulate that in your long run training too, whether that's layer up a bit more if you're going to a hot climate.
We did that for I was wearing double layers because it's 7 degrees.
Yep.
Training in the morning.
We had a pretty cold sort of lead in from Sydney, and it wasn't. Yeah, like I think you guys got pretty lucky this weekend up at Gold Coast. Well, this year's weather at Gold Coast. But yeah, I think it's important to simulate that stuff. I think altitude's undone me a bit in the past. Like you've got to, I guess, anticipate the impacts of climbing sort of high peaks and altitude, and the impact that has on your intensity and how you can sort of maintain your nutrition and stuff through that. I think, there's lots of things that can vary, and marathon's definitely a distance that you can still hit all of that stuff with.
Well, marathon, I have a new level of anxiety for the marathon. Like, I feel like, for example, the half and like everything you can kind of get your head around, because I feel there's not as many unknowns. I mean, obviously things can go wrong, but I fear the marathon.
I think half marathons, if things are going wrong, you can kind of patch it up and suffer through it and still kind of scrape it in.
It's not that far.
Whereas marathons are long enough that if things are going wrong, before the halfway mark, you're going to have to modify what you're doing to get to the finish line. But there's no point fearing it. Like, if you're consistently training and you're practicing all of those bits and pieces and you're doing your best, it's an opportunity to perform. And sure, there's potential that it may not go your way, but you could do even better than planned on the day. I think questioning that fear is important, and flip it into it being an opportunity. That's why I still get excited about 100k start lines. It's like,
I mean,
shit's gonna go down.
It's exciting. I mean, there is excitement.
Maybe I did. I think either way you learn something.
100%.
That's what keeps me coming back, isn't it?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
if you're not learning as a human, and I think the resilience I've developed in all facets of my life through what I've learnt from my running endeavours is huge. And I think in the bigger picture, there's always another race, there's always another go at something. It's always an opportunity to discover something new about yourself, and
it is.
Hopefully that's a PB, but sometimes it's
not.
Well, that gel doesn't work. These shoes suck. Shape is a bitch. There's lots to learn.
Well, I guess all of those things that go wrong are just a calibration in the end, but they feel pretty grim at the time. But but that's right, I guess. All right, my training week. So, guys, we're on Wednesday. This is typical Luke training week. 40 minutes in. I'll tell you about all my thoughts for the run as well. Tom's like, come on, get on with it. tomorrow we got 60-minute steady, which I'm scared about. Not scared, but
Yeah,
I haven't run 60 minutes in.
Maybe there should be you and I having a coffee chat. It's great. There is a lot of fear and apprehension. And, I think it probably stems from a lot of things. And race experience is one of those things. Like, you've come into running more seriously at a time when there were no races for 2 years.
True.
So I think the more you get to practice kind of running in actual events, the more comfortable you get with your pre-race strategy and your nutrition strategy, and that you can handle it. Like, you sort of need a few races where things go wrong and you pick yourself back up, or you figure out a solution, and you build that confidence in your own ability to workshop things on the go. But there's a lot of times that you're like, I'm scared.
I don't know if I just sometimes put too many of my thoughts out there. I'm like, I don't know if I can do this.
What I find interesting though, so firstly, I'm just going to say, coaching someone that has a running podcast where they recap every single week is really advantageous. Great way to get like an extra layer of, I've literally listened to all of your episodes, but
just
most
the training.
of them, it's just the
Well, that's most of the episode most of the time.
You got me!
A number of times you're like, I haven't done this, I'm going to get in trouble. When have I ever gotten you in trouble?
That's my I should clarify. That's my perception of trouble.
I know, I find it really interesting that that's your default. We should talk about a little bit more at some time. Because I can tell you, I'm not sat there going, will the box go green? Is he going to do some strength work?
I get myself in trouble. Oh yeah, the strength work. Oh, I'm sorry. No.
So 60 minutes.
Yeah. I'm looking forward to it. It's just...
There we go.
Yeah.
It's an opportunity.
Yeah, it's an opportunity to grow as a runner. Okay? There we go. Let's be positive. It'll be interesting. I think Tobias is going to join for 40 minutes. I think we might just go out a bit conservative to save a death march for the final 20 minutes. I would say I'm back. Pre-COVID, I'm probably still about 90-95%, I would say. But you probably noticed my heart rate a week ago.
Yeah.
When I was on the oval, it was just shot up straight away.
Yeah, super high.
Which is interesting, but expected, right?
Yeah. And that's why we don't push hard in this phase of recovery. Like, it's a minority of people, but you can definitely have cardiac complications with COVID and the vaccine. So, I tread a little bit gently with both of those things because I've had know people who have had myocarditis from COVID, and I know people I've coached who have had pericarditis from vaccinations. So, we just got to be a little bit smart about returning to full training. But I think, so far this week you've been doing well, and I think if your perception is that you're sort of back to that kind of 90-95%, then hopefully by next week you'll be feeling 100%.
And then Saturday, Friday, day off. I've been enjoying the day off.
Okay.
See, the funny thing is I forget what I say, and I probably literally just repeat myself. I do. Clearly. Saturday, easy 45, and Sunday, I was trying to get a race entry, but that got knocked back. I remember talking to Tobias, like, do you want to do your session? We'll do the race, we'll turn it back. And I was like, let me see. Hi, Sally. Can I do a half marathon? I was like, my preference is no. I'm a salesman, hang on. I won't go out too hard, I'll just, but you're 100% correct. I would go out too hard.
And I think that's it. Like, look, if you weren't coming off the back of COVID, I'd be more likely to say, sure, but you're going to have to do, you know, a 5K kind of warm up and a 5K cool down at a particular pace, we can integrate that into a session, no problems. And I'm usually quite happy to work around sort of events as kind of B events. But I think given that we've lost a couple of weeks of, you know, marathon specific long runs, my preference is to sort of tick a few of those off and be focused on those rather than potentially distracted by everyone else running faster and wanting to keep up.
I know. Like reflecting on it, I know what was going to happen. I've gone too hard, and then it would be a 4-day recovery.
But exactly. Like you can't afford to lose the midweek training at the moment. If your energy levels are good, we want to keep building on that.
Absolutely. No, I appreciate that. It's just I get bright ideas.
Oh, so do I. It's just as bad.
So thank you. And that's my training week.
Cool. It's enough.
Quite a few, I think. Where do we maybe take us back to the going from sort of running 70 when I ran 75 minutes. That was at the beginning of the coaching, I think, or we done
it
it
like
Canberra.
for Canberra, pre
a month or less than a month in.
I think you'd been on board for a couple of weeks, so it was a good opportunity to sort of see where you were at, definitely. So do you mean you want to reflect on?
So we did testing. We did testing. We did a bit of training. Then we did Canberra. So you were sort of seeing what the figures are like. Actually, what are you looking for when you're testing?
So I guess when an athlete comes on board, I guess the thing I'm first interested in is what their training for, at least the last 3 months has been. And, generally their running history. But, as we kind of went through when I kind of brought you on board, we have a bit of a long chat about everything. But so using the power meter and, I guess gauging intensity as a power kind of is more, we need to build an initial kind of profile on you, I guess. I need to get a bit of a feeling for what you can do over particular distances, and it's what we call a power duration curve, and the power is generally quite high at the really short pointy end of that curve. So at your 5 second, 10 second kind of efforts, obviously you can put out a heap more power than what you can hold over 1 hour, 2 hour and longer. So by modeling that curve and sort of hitting a few max efforts over lots of different time points, so anywhere from 5, 10, 15 second sprints to 5 minute max efforts to sort of a 9 minute to 5k and a 10k or a half, depending on what you're targeting, can all be really helpful to sort of quite quickly build an initial snapshot of what your particular curve looks like. And that helps to model where your lactate threshold is. So generally we need ideally a couple of months of training data, hitting a few different intensities to really get a solid idea of that curve for you as an individual. But when that curve is robust, it correlates really strongly with lactate testing if you were to go into a lab. So that's why I like power meters, because they help me model more accurately where your true threshold is at that particular time without having to run you on a treadmill hooked up to all sorts of things and spending heaps of money doing it. So I find, usually we'll do a 2-week protocol, which involves hitting some of those key sessions.
Lots of pain.
But again, like your reaction to and people react differently. Like sometimes I don't phrase it as max effort because I know it freaks people out. It's just like have some fun and do some little sprints.
Very, very hard. And try and shut your brain off.
But and that stuff takes practice too. Like running hard takes practice. So a lot of that testing is also getting you used to running at different intensities again. But once I'd sort of modelled what your threshold was, and particularly once we had data for Canberra in terms of what you held over a half marathon and what with the stride pods, I get a lot more detail in terms of your how you're actually running, like what's your cadence doing, what's your ground contact time, what's your vertical oscillation doing. And so when we track that relative to what your heart rate's doing over a consistent effort, if your power to heart rate ratio is getting bigger and bigger and bigger toward the end of an event, we know you actually weren't fit enough to execute that event perfectly at that power.
Right.
So I get a lot of information in that. Well, I got a lot of information on you in that first couple of weeks that then allowed me to get a pretty good idea of, okay, if your threshold stayed where it was right now and we went into marathon training, if you were to race at 90% of that threshold and hold form and be fit for it, what does that time look like and how does that compare to what you're actually chasing? And when we did that, there was still a bit of a gap, like we needed to lift your threshold a bit more for you to be able to more comfortably hold a marathon pace that better represents sort of your ultimate goal.
Yep.
And I think what's great about you, Luke, is that you recognize that marathons, you don't just do one build and tick a box and move on necessarily. And I think the more that you race marathons and sort of train for them, any distance really, chasing PBs, it's a really exponential kind of curve. You just seconds take way more effort to sort of scrape that stuff up. So I think Melbourne will be your first sort of real test at the marathon distance, and whether we get the ideal sort of time or not, we'll see. But I think you're definitely a lot closer to being able to execute on that time now than you were when you started, and really that's because you've done the hard work. But so essentially the way we've structured your training was we did a lot of VO2 stuff and sort of higher intensity super threshold work.
I remember you telling me like half your job is going to be convincing yourself that you can still run hard when your mind's screaming at you.
Yeah.
And that what it is, it's like you can still push, but I never got used to that previously.
Yeah.
And it's been
the fact that anyone can pick up the pace in the last K of pretty much any race they do ever.
Yeah.
It's just a reminder that we are rarely tapping into our actual max. And obviously some can tap a lot harder, like one of your past people that had a cardiac arrest at a finish line. Like, I think that's probably the most impressive emptying the tank I've heard of. But I think there's always generally more to give in it. You've got to practice the psychological game as well, but really the point of those sessions was to lift your lactate threshold, so then everything that's sub-threshold is faster and feels easier.
So you lift it by doing the VO2 max stuff. A lot of time you hear running at threshold.
Yeah, so we were dancing sort of around that. So the key sessions were kind of lifting or working sort of VO2, and then I think some of the other kind of intervals that we were moving into are more threshold sort of based things. And then often I was time trialing you for some 5Ks, which I think are a good way to kind of practice that as well. And then things got pretty, I guess Gold Coast wasn't that far away in terms of needing to hit some sort of half marathon specific workouts as well. So I think it'll be fun to sort of see where we get to with Melbourne, and then we've got a heap more information to work off in terms of how your body responded to particular sort of training stimuli, and then we can keep refining and keep going faster.
Sounds good to me. One thing I noticed was threshold is a lot harder than what I thought it was, because I think I've talked about this before, and I probably I used to track it via heart rate, and sort of when my heart rate got to 180 or 185, this is previously, I'd be like, okay, I'm at threshold, and slow down. But when we were doing, for example, 7-minute reps and up to 14-minute reps, it feels much harder. So that's what I've learned. Yeah,
and I think that's what I really enjoyed when I personally sort of moved to power. So, my coach, was an early adopter of power. And, I think for me, I'm not the world's most gifted runner. My tendency is to hold back and to be more conservative, which is probably why I execute longer stuff a bit better. But for me it was like, oh shit, you mean I actually do have the potential to run that fast? Like, it was actually stepping up and going, I'm limiting myself psychologically with what feels hard to me. It being shown sort of that potential to actually go even harder gives you that confidence to try harder. And then I think perceived effort is so subjective, and I think that's really something you need to train as well as someone that's new to running too. I think a lot of recreational runners are undershooting the mark with perceived effort because they haven't had the experience of digging super deep before. I think we still need to listen to heart rate, but was your threshold heart rate, like how did you actually establish that in the first place? Because I think there is individual nuance to that, and I've got protocols that we can actually test heart rate thresholds and still train to heart rate, but I think power has been sort of far superior, and then heart rate becomes the refiner. So we now know what your heart rate tends to be at 90% threshold, and now that you're coming back from COVID, we know that there's been a difference from that, and that's really valuable to us in terms of where you're at in your recovery. Whereas if you're not paying attention to that stuff, you think you feel fine, but you're actually still putting a lot more stress on your physiology than you may be ready for.
Definitely. At that sort of 292 watts before COVID, I definitely felt like, I don't know, you can just feel it. You just feel so much better.
Yeah.
But you can feel it return as well. I guess that's the good thing about knowing your body after doing quite a lot of training. But another thing I noticed, which is really great, is you don't have to train. You don't have to run 140 Ks to get fitter.
Oh my God.
That was a great... Talk to us about mileage.
Yeah. Look, I have listened to more complete episodes of this podcast and many running podcasts, and something that it really does just drive me nuts is how many people just love to throw around weekly mileage as some sort of comparison. Like, just getting back into it, running 130k weeks, or like, one, there's always a fuck ton of ego behind it. And two, it's a completely irrelevant number unless there's more context around it. Like, for me, running 100k's in a week is something I've achieved probably on one hand, and 2 of those times have been in a race. 24 hours. I don't do well with massive volume, and I don't need it to perform over the distances that I perform over. But I think we're all different, and we've all got different thresholds, we've all got different physiology, we've all got different sort of running histories and experience, and I just think it's a really pointless number to throw around, because either people are going to get competitive with it and get trapped in this stupid Strava land.
Do you have Strava?
Do I have Strava?
Do you have Strava?
I had to have Strava to do the speed project. I do have a Strava account that I look at it maybe once a year, and I generally don't let people follow me because I can't be bothered to fill in the detail to give context to what I'm doing, so why the fuck should it matter to anyone what I'm actually running? I just think that it's really misleading, and I think chasing weekly mileage and that number always has to be above a certain benchmark that you've set because everyone else around you has decided that that's a good idea is the best way to get injured. And I think it's probably the culprit for the vast majority of running injuries that we see in recreational runners, is that they're chasing stupid mileage goals that aren't really specific to the race goals that they've got. For yourselves to run 100k weeks comes pretty easily because you naturally run faster, and that it's more the intensity that it takes for you to achieve that. So if your threshold pace is 3:30 minute kilometers, whereas my threshold pace is 4:45s. For me to run 100 Ks would mean I would have to run a higher intensity for way longer, and it's a much bigger metabolic tax to achieve that.
Yeah.
So either you're overtraining because you're pushing a too high an intensity for too many hours that you actually probably don't have time to recover from, or you're just out there slogging it out to tick a box and make that number a round number, and probably running with terrible form and to the detriment of lots of other things that are important to recovery again. So, why be adding more hours of non-specific shit technique to your week at the detriment of actually doing a decent food shop and being able to prepare decent meals, or be actually able to have time to unwind with your family before you go to bed, and optimizing sleep. And I just think there's just so many reasons why it's a stupid thing to throw around. And I think for it's a power trip a lot of the time too. Sure, if you're discussing weekly mileage with a group of runners that are targeting the same thing, if you're all 800 meter runners or 5k runners, and you're all a similar demographic, maybe there's some relevance there if you're all training to the same methodology. But I just think it's a useless number, and I call bullshit.
And thank you for calling bullshit and stopping me from running 130k weeks unnecessarily, and also not getting fitter and getting injured.
Exactly. There's a time and a place for high mileage if you can handle it, and if it is beneficial to what you're targeting as a runner. But for a 45-year-old female that's wanting to do a 50k trail event, you may only need to run 40 Ks a week on, more specific terrain, and do strength work to more than adequately finish a race like that. Whereas to keep drilling down on, a really top-end marathon time, and you've spent 10 years as a marathon runner, then you're probably going to be able to handle way more mileage. And so, again, terrain, if you're doing 3,000 meters of elevation a week, then doing 100 Ks in that terrain is going to take way more time.
So what I'm hearing is need a bit more context.
Yeah.
It's all about the context.
Yeah.
I just think it's a pointless thing to discuss. It's more, how many hours are you training at a race specific pace, and how's that feeling for you, and how have you been able to progress that? And I think those conversations are interesting and useful, but just random Ks with no context is completely useless and often detrimental to most people that hear that number.
Well, what's your experience, Dom, with
I
chasing
think
mileage, or just thinking about that in general?
I think chasing mileage has gotten me fit in the past, but I think that it gets to a point sometimes where if you just keep going at it, and it's probably like what you said, there's certain periods in time when building the mileage is a good thing for you, but if you keep going at it and at it and at it, you get to this point where you just kind of level out, and everything just falls into this grey zone where you're never really recovering.
You're not adequately responding to the stimulus you've applied to your body, and so it's just it's exactly that. It's a grey zone, and it's the best way to be a mediocre version of yourself.
Well, I mean, for example, if you looked at my Strava a year and a half ago and saw I was running 130 Ks and looked at Gold Coast build-up, you wouldn't be able to, tells you nothing.
But the intensity that you were able to hold in your weekly mileage leading into Gold Coast was heaps higher than what you were doing with 130 Ks.
So you run 90 Ks, but doing crazy sessions to stretch fitness and stuff like that.
Appropriate sessions for your goals.
Sorry. Disclaimer.
But then recovering properly from the sessions before you go again.
Fueling appropriately through them.
And I guess the pros, they can recover by jogging around and stuff.
Yeah.
Whereas I don't know, your average punter or whoever is running whatever time recreationally.
They've got jobs and families and a whole bunch of shit that chews up recovery time. 100%. If we were all pro runners and could do a session in the morning, have a great, second breakfast after it, and sit in Normatec boots watching TV for a couple of hours before our next session. Sweet. I'm Ireland, sure, we'll probably all tolerate it. But when you're getting up at 4 a.m. to do your longer session at the end of a marathon build before you go to work for 10 to 12 hours, which you're potentially on your feet for, and then having to get home and feed yourself and, actually still try and get some shape of sleep into your life as well. Stuff has to give, and you're just going to be really, I guess, intentional about where you're putting your training effort and what that metabolic cost is to you on the bigger picture as well.
I'm curious about, when we're sort of when fatigue's building up, how do you tell? How do you tell?
Enough?
Yeah. Because I'm not sure how you program these sessions and know, because you have a good gauge of what I can tolerate. So not crazy sessions, but as you said.
I guess I obviously do apply a fair bit of data to that, but I'm quite specific in terms of the metrics that I'm using, and really any time I'm sort of calling on data, it's to try and refine that. Whereas I find a lot of algorithms, particularly like the inbuilt stuff on your Garmin's and stuff, it's always like, oh, you're underperforming, you're losing fitness because you went for a bloody easy recovery run. Your Garmin has no idea of the context it is yet. I'm sure they'll get there. But so I guess the main things that I'm looking at are a chronic training load relative to your acute training load and what that ratio is sort of doing. So chronic training load is something that Training Peaks, the platform that I program through, is really good at automatically calculating. This is probably going to get a bit dry for a minute, sorry, but essentially, every time you go for a run with a power meter on, the session that you do attributes a training stress score, or TSS, and that's a finite number that sort of objectively categorizes how much stress you've applied to your body relative to where your current threshold is. If you have a stress score for each session that you've done every day over a week, the total of that is your acute training load. If you were to the average total of that 7 days is your acute training load. If you were to average 42 days of training, that's more your chronic training load and beyond. So if you're building too quickly, your acute training load is going to go up higher, and that ratio is going to become, essentially, it's going to become more negative, really. And so the sort of form that we look at, or the other sort of number that we look at, when you're building, you want that to be negative to a degree. But if you're pushing way too negative, then your injury risk starts to go up considerably. And there is some science behind sort of acute to chronic training load ratios and where the sweet spot for that is. So when I'm building your program, I'm already writing in the intensity into the file, so it estimates your TSS for those sessions.
Right.
So I can predict what your chronic training load will be at the end of that week and what your acute training load will be at the end of that week, and I can keep building that out. So so I've written your program, the skeleton of your program, all the way to Melbourne, but I'm refining it each week based on what you actually did and where your chronic training load is sitting at the moment, and whether you're sort of too negative for my lacking, or we can work a bit harder. So I think those metrics are the really rough guides that I use to initially pitch how much you can handle, and then we refine that based on what's your heart rate doing over those steady state sessions? Are you fit enough to handle this yet, or do we need to sort of build that fitness out a bit more? Are you hitting those power intensities, or do we need to break it down into sort of smaller chunks for you to practice hitting that? Because there's the practicing running hard component versus the you're just too tired to perform component. If you're sitting in a positive sort of balance and you're not hitting a power target, and everything else in your life is going great, then you probably just need to learn to suffer a bit more and practice running hard a bit more. Whereas if I know that you can hit those intensities and you have hit those intensities and now you're falling short and you are getting sort of more negative, then maybe it is just that we need to back off a little bit on overall volume. So there's sort of lots of things that I'm looking at. Probably not a particularly concise summary, but it's always nuanced with me as well. I'm just not a very black and white person.
Well, it's not very simple stuff to
it is and it isn't. Like, essentially we're objectively quantifying the stress you're applying to your body, and if you're applying stress too quickly over too many weeks consecutively, you're gonna break. So it's really just putting some caveats around that and modeling it in a way that I can sort of predict the outcome when I'm writing the program, so I'm less likely to write too much for you and break you.
Okay.
You don't like breaking.
Thank you. I'm happy about that.
But I don't like you slacking off. Not that you slack off, but you know what I mean? Like, it's easy to think that you're still training appropriately, but often you get stuck in those ruts of, it's Monday, so I do this, and it's Tuesday, so I do that, and it's Wednesday, so I do, and you're not getting anywhere close to the return on investment if you modify the intensity a little bit more specific to your running goal. You could get a heap more bang for buck out of the hours you're throwing at this. And I guess that's kind of the other thing. One, I like to minimize injuries, but lots of us, unfortunately, we're not all pro athletes, and time is really precious, and training time is really precious. And if we're not making the most out of that training time relative to our running goals, then we're kind of wasting our time.
100%. I forgot what I was going to ask next.
I forgot.
Marathon training. So I've noticed it's very sort of just below threshold sort of stuff. Is that, if you were to do, because obviously we've done a lot of work for half marathon, would you sort of just keep doing that if I didn't train for example, Gold Coast? Would it be a lot of
the same intensity?
Yeah, like just...
Yeah, I think when we're, a few weeks out, I tend to drop the higher intensity stuff for the midweek sessions and build out more sort of that 90% range. And, I generally sort of call those sessions sweet spot sessions. And it's about building up your tolerance to how much you can sort of handle in those sessions and still recover. And I guess there is a limit to how long I will push people, and it comes down to that sort of total stress score for that particular workout. I don't like that to be considerably more than your chronic training load. Like if your midweek runs are 4 or 5 times what your chronic training load number is at the time, then we're probably going to break you. But when you said yourself, sort of marathon pace can feel a bit awkward if you're not used to running at it. Like, you've come off the back of practicing running half marathon pace.
Yeah,
so
a lot of
it
threshold.
is finding that, like, hold back. Okay, now it's actually kind of hard. Hold on. And figuring out where that new sort of time is, and you're much more likely to be able to, get used to running at that pace if we've broken it down into chunks. But as we get closer to race day, those chunks get chunked together, so you practice sort of holding it for longer periods of time.
It's interesting.
But then I guess for the long runs, although a lot of that is still at sort of marathon intensity, I think it's important to practice variations within that intensity, because it's very rare that you get to run a road marathon with no hills or wind or people that you need to get around, or corners that you need to turn. So being able to push a little bit harder and then still recover and still be able to maintain an average of that intensity is an important skill to practice as well.
Yeah, definitely. We've got a big workout on Sunday, and I'm sure there's I'm sure there's a bigger one coming.
Yeah. I've let you see those ones now. Maybe because you kept annoying me about running a half marathon.
And that's the other thing, actually, which I've been, thinking that there's going to be the perfect marathon prep. And sort of, because I was even thinking, do I do Melbourne? And then I was like, stop being stupid. Like,
I
need to get one.
If you wait till it's perfect, it's never going to happen.
Yep.
And look, every now and then you will get that race and you're like, mate, I had the best prep, everything just came together on the day, it felt good, it hurt in all the right ways, and I got, more than what I thought I could achieve. Like, and that's what keeps you coming back as well. But it's the shit days that are just important to your athletic development. And I think practicing races is really important. Even if, maybe you've taken a couple of weeks of, not training where we had hoped that maybe you could train if everything was perfect. Life isn't perfect, and it's very rare that someone will complete a full marathon build and not have to take a step sideways or backwards, or it's about, there's so many different ways to get to race day, and at the end of the day it's an opportunity to learn.
It's kind of like, I don't know, it's unfortunate that the date's like locked as well. Like you can't just wait until you're absolutely at your peak and then
that's in my head. I'm like, maybe we can do another. I'm like, no.
But there's no Melbourne Marathon. Like, I don't know.
Exactly. And there are fallback races, and I think now that things have opened up more, and probably the thing that my coach, Nathan Fenton, drilled into me, or probably watched me bang my head against the wall way too many times, but really that is the holy grail, is to build the fitness at a pace that you're recovering from in a way that's sustainable. Wait till you're ready to strike, and then find the race to slot in and execute on. And when we're not in the middle of a pandemic, there usually are races every couple of weeks. Obviously it's harder with road marathons, there's more of a season to it. There aren't as many in the middle of summer and the middle of winter, but you can generally always find an opportunity to test that fitness once you've developed it. Whereas I think we do get really fixated on it has to be Melbourne and everything has to go right, and not being prepared to adjust that plan. And I think for you, Luke, I'm not concerned that the little speed bump of getting COVID is necessarily going to significantly impact your ability to still learn a lot and potentially perform really well on race day. If I thought that goal was getting too far away from what was achievable or what was safe for you without risking you having to take a huge amount of time to recover at the end of it, then we would be discussing other goals. But I think it's important. It's hard. You do kind of get hyped up for a particular event, and it is really nice when it all comes together on that day. But I think if you're not in it for the longer game and see it in the bigger context, you just end up running broken and underperforming all the time.
Absolutely.
It's interesting. I feel like on the track it's a lot more clearer, like that philosophy where you just sort of get fit for this period of time and then pick and choose your races, because when you're running track you've got to race on like every weekend, and it's just
and you
like
can kind of race into fitness a bit as well, like.
And like not every race is going to go to plan. Like the race is just over so quickly that it's hard to kind of just pick one race and execute it. But the same applies with any race, really.
And I think that the more you get to the pointier end of any sport, the more that's amplified. Like if you're aiming for the Olympics, that literally only happens once every 4 years. So I think it's kind of nice as more a recreational runner, because there's way more times that we can sort of execute those things, whereas the more you move up the upper echelons of sport, I think the higher the pressure is.
You wouldn't want to get sick or something before
and
an
it
Olympic
happens
marathon.
but then bloody Killian Jornet still won UTMB with record time and had COVID. So,
What?
yeah.
Oh,
Yeah, did you have COVID? I didn't know that.
Yeah,
Yeah,
he
wow.
had COVID apparently, but he didn't have symptoms and there's no restrictions now, so he still raced.
Yeah, far out.
I wouldn't condone that. It's not my preferred approach, but when you're Killian Jornet, you know.
Some people are just built differently.
He's just a different level of human.
Yeah. So crazy.
I've lost track of time. I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know. I do have. I don't know. We were gonna. I did want to talk about zone 2, but it's zone 2 training because I've heard a lot, and I feel like it potentially could be one of those things where it's like a very general thing with no context.
Yeah, I guess like there's so many different approaches that will work for different people. I think zone 2 is well, it depends on how you define that.
That's the thing.
Yeah.
How would you define it, for example? I trust your definition.
Well, I guess it depends how many zones there are. Like, are you talking zone 2 training when there's only 3 zones, or are you talking zone 2 training when there's 7?
It's normally like the easier running before a certain point where you are kind of in between. You're not near marathon pace.
Yeah,
you're not near
usually it's
threshold.
going to be a percentage of either your heart rate threshold or your power threshold. I think spending time in zone 2 is great for sort of more your aerobic fitness building. I think what's hard, I think there's lots of things that come into that. One, I think most people don't run easy enough a lot of the time, so it ends up being more like zone 3 when it should be zone 2. So being a bit more precise about what actually zone 2 is and sticking to it, I think is advantageous for some people.
Yeah.
I think it depends though on how many hours you've got to throw at something and how you respond to volume and where your sort of specific sessions need to be. So I think I'm probably always going to be too nuanced to give you many firm answers on that.
That's fair.
I think that a lot of that stuff, it does come from sort of cycling and triathlon as well, and I think your ability to condition yourself in cycling is way easier than running in terms of wear and tear to your body. I think with anything that's running, you need to be really gradual with how you're building up into any new kind of training. And if you just sort of think that, I'm running more in zone 2 and not doing the harder sessions so I can just run forever, you're probably still going to end up broken if you do it too suddenly. Yeah,
and I think what you talked about in terms of zone 3, or what's called maybe the grey zone.
Yeah.
One thing that's I find useful is nasal breathing, which I think you've talked about, which is a really good way to limit.
Yeah, stop you getting sort of carried away. And I think the fitter you get, the easier it is to run a bit quicker, like you're moving efficiently and you're sort of conditioned to do it. But I think, the temptation then is to sort of run too hard on your easy days. So whether you call that zone 2 or you call that an easy run that's limited by nasal breathing, or define it however you will. I think it sort of comes down to the greater context of
it's
what you're trying to achieve.
Bit too complex because you're leaving out what race do you want to go for, how have you trained in the past. So that's apologies for asking an impossible question.
I think it's important to recognize that anything you're reading about any new way of training or new way of eating or new way of doing anything, I have no problem with zone 2 training. I just think it's such a, there's so many different ways you can define it that it's kind of a pointless definition unless you're sort of executing it as per whichever source you've read that from. I think it's important to always be trying things on yourself and trying to be objective about how you're responding to things, but I think it's also important to be a little bit wary of anything that's being thrown at you which is said to be all or nothing. I think Chapo probably touched on this a fair bit with nutrition in terms of red flags. Like if someone's, really vilifying one macro or, one particular food group, or it's the same for training. If someone's like, no, you should only do this, that's always, ever, then they've probably got an agenda. And it's probably not going to work for everyone, because if it did, we'd all be doing it by now. So I think it's important to try different styles of training, and that's where, recording your training data and how you personally are feeling for particular sessions, and then reflecting on that at the end of a block, at the end of a race. Did this actually work for me compared to the last time? I think all of that's really important sort of information to be learning about yourself. But yeah, I don't have any particular problems with any particular style of training. It's just whether it's actually working for that individual. And if you're getting too sort of laser focused, and if you've bought in too hard to a philosophy that's maybe actually just leading to chronic injury, that's sort of where having someone that can be a bit more objective, like a coach or a running partner or something, can be helpful, I think.
Absolutely. One thing I did want to touch on is a little bit about diet, and because you hear there's the tendency to want to be lighter sometimes, which can be, I know I've talked to you about this before.
Yeah, that's probably the other thing I'd love to call bullshit on is race weight. Fucking hate that term.
Yeah. So that's the classic. And I know. It's alright. No sponsors gonna. Even though last episode we should. Anyway, Don tried to get a sponsor. He wants a car company to sponsor us. I don't know what's gonna happen. But anyway.
Yeah, look, I think that's something that so many runners come up against, and it's the reality of being in a weight dependent sport. Yes, when you look at the pure physics, in general, being lighter will probably lead to being able to move faster, but at what cost and for how long? I think there's lots of things that go into that too, and I think again, Chapo's episode sort of touched on that. REDS, so relative energy deficiency in sport. I think really it's in life, particularly when you're looking at the context of recreational runners and elites. But yeah, I think I hate the fixation on what most people just randomly attribute to be their ideal goal race weight. I think the weight that you are when you rock up to the start line after having a great preparation, fueling, recovering appropriately, and listening to your body through that process, that is your race weight for that particular race. And that may not be the same weight that you are the next time you do that. I think your body will often change over the course of a training block, and sometimes you will lose a bit of weight and sometimes you won't. I think what's really complicated in that space is what's driving that desire, and is it purely performance, and is it being adequately monitored by people that understand the consequences and can appropriately advise you on that? So are you working with a sports dietitian and a sports doctor, and is it deemed appropriate for you to be at that weight? And I think sure, if you're targeting the Olympics and you've got one opportunity to execute, you're going to probably try and be as light as is safe to be on that day. But if you're working a full-time job and you're running 4 marathons a year and you're constantly trying to be smaller and smaller, you're going to end up breaking in more ways than one. And I think, unfortunately, particularly for a lot of female runners, and it's definitely not just female runners, but there's probably equal portions of people that are trying to be light purely to perform better, and people that are potentially using exercise or having sort of quite a disordered relationship with food in the first place to justify running so much. There's a lot of I think eating disorders and disordered eating that can sort of fuel that fixation on weight, and I think there's a lot of body dysmorphia in society in general that really pushes people to be fitting one particular mold that's completely unrealistic in terms of what's sustainable for them to keep performing over years and years and years. So Yeah.
It's dangerous.
It's dangerous. And, you know, I think, like I've been there personally. I've, you know, ended up in a really bad place with food and exercise for a number of years and had the stress fractures to sort of show for it. I just think the acceptance of stress fractures as being kind of a consequence of just being a runner is something that we really need to challenge. And, you know, I'm quite passionate, I guess, particularly with my female athletes, in making sure we're tracking things like their menstrual cycle and, you know, how hormonally sort of healthy they are. And it's never going to be about what you weigh on race day. It's going to be, you know, are you fueling enough? I think that the problem that, you know, I didn't even realize, and, you know, I've got a science background, is you can get away with it for so long because your body is your best friend and your body is incredibly resourceful, and you can, you know, be burning the candle at both ends and running high intensities, high volume in an energy deficit and see performance improvements for a certain period of time. But once your body has pulled out all its tricks to try and support you doing that for as long as it possibly can, you know, you've fucked your bone density, you've destroyed your hormones, and that can take years and years to recover from, and you may never recover from it. I think, unfortunately, there's, you know, generations of female athletes at the pointy end of things where it was accepted that if you had your period, you weren't training hard enough, and those women have severe osteoporosis and, you know, lots of long-term cardiac impacts, and there's so many different body systems that, you know, being in an energy deficit affects. And I think recreational runners are really high risk at experiencing energy deficits, and whether that's because they just don't realize how much you've got to eat to keep up, or whether it's because they're kind of chasing being thin for reasons that maybe aren't helpful to their long-term health, is really complex.
So you shouldn't, like, when you think caloric deficit in training it can be a bit dangerous. Is that implying you're not recovering properly?
Yeah, exactly. Like, you know, and men and women are very different in that space. I think, you know, when you strip it back to evolution and go, well, when there's not much food around, generally it's because there's not much food around, not because we're choosing not to eat what's on the shelf or in the fridge. And so what do, you know, men historically need to do? They need to lean up to hunt and go find the food. What do women need to do? Well, whether you actually want kids or not, unfortunately, our physiology is geared to optimizing reproduction. And if it's not safe to reproduce, if there's not enough energy to safely carry a pregnancy, then that stuff gets shut down pretty quickly. You know, what else is going to happen? Well, your general metabolism is going to be downregulated because your body's trying to protect you and let you still survive and do all of the things with less energy being provided. And that's all well and good when it's a temporary situation and there's going to be hopefully a feast at the end of it. But if you're applying a heap of physical stress to that system and you've shut down your hormones to the level where, you know, everything's suppressed, then the knock-on effects are going to be that you're going to not have enough estrogen to have appropriate bone density, and you only have a certain number of years in your development to lay down new bone, and once you get to a particular age, that doesn't get any better. So if you fuck around with you know, your hormones and your energy levels through your 20s and 30s, there's definitely consequences as you age with that. And I just don't think there's much societal awareness to the impacts of that. You know, it affects your brain, it affects your heart, it affects like your sex hormones, it affects everything. And I just think it's probably a consequence of so much dieting culture in the last sort of 2 generations of people that we just don't know what normal is anymore. It's so socially acceptable to be dieting and restricting and trying to lose weight. And, you know, I think that model's been broken for a very long time. If just eating less led to being healthy and thin, then we wouldn't be having the, you know, obesity and diabetes epidemic that we're having across the globe. So yeah, I don't know. I think it's a really important thing to be aware of, but I think it is really nuanced, and if you're someone that is hitting a chord for, I think it's really important to know that there's plenty of places you can reach out to for support, but there's also plenty of places you can reach out to for education. If you're not sure where to go, feel free to hit me up. There's people that I think do a really good job in these spaces. But yeah, I think it's about sort of an education piece that in general our recreational running community doesn't really understand the impacts of reaching for these really big goals and training this hard and managing all of the other stresses of life, and you can slip into that energy deficit quite easily.
It's a scary place to be. And
it's so like personal as well. Like I feel like no one really is super open about it, and
it's a hard one to be open about.
Yeah, it is, and I think it gets even harder. The higher up you go in the sporting institutions, a lot of the time too. I think there's definitely some team cultures that are really turning the tide on this and really switched on in terms of training around menstrual cycles with female athletes and things. But when your livelihood then depends on performance and you're in a weight dependent sport, and you're not fitting the molds, the pressures on you to conform to being as tiny as you possibly can are huge. And if that's a sort of educated decision that you make and you fully understand the long-term consequences of that and you get paid appropriately for that, then maybe it's justified. But there's no money in running. And I don't think, we just haven't had the information and the science to sort of back it up. I think there's been a lot in the last 10 years on particularly female athlete, development and avoiding all of these sorts of issues. But I think the more we're talking about it, the better.
For sure. Yeah. It's a big topic that you can't really get past.
Yeah, and I think it's just there's so many things that drive us to run, and I think it's important to look out for each other, particularly if we're in run crews and we're sort of noticing changes in people around us. Sort of reaching out to them, I think, is helpful. They may not be ready to sort of hear what you've got to say, but if someone's constantly turning up to training injured and training through that, like asking them some questions about why in a supportive way. Like it's not necessarily saying that they've got an eating disorder, but do they just value running so much because they don't have support networks in other areas of their life, and are there ways that we can be building some support for them that doesn't mean that they have to come and run through injury? I think there's lots of reasons to sort of reach out to people if we're sort of seeing some trends. If someone's shrinking before your eyes and getting injured more and more, then whether it's intentional or unintentional, having a conversation about maybe it's worth sort of talking to a dietitian or a sports doctor and just sort of seeing whether there's things you could optimize, or initiating those conversations I think can be helpful.
Absolutely. It is good to know, even just hearing something like that, or might cause people to think about, maybe this is not normal.
I think like the eating disorder stuff is really hard, and not everyone's necessarily ready to unpack that. Usually it's going to be a coping mechanism for something else, and I think everyone's going to be at a different phase of that journey sometimes, but knowing that if they're starting to recognize that what they're doing isn't working for them, and that's where I ended up in a moon boot, crying over eating a banana because I was so afraid of carbohydrates at the time. Like you kind of have those moments where you go, well look, this isn't actually working for me anymore and I need to try something different. And if you are in that space or feel like you've got some tendencies there, then just knowing that there is support around you if you need it, and reaching out for that.
Did you reach out to anyone in particular?
Yeah, it's hard. Like, I generally think I'm a pretty self-aware person, and I was never formally diagnosed with, one of the big three. Usually they only really recognise anorexia, bulimia or binge sort of eating, but there's a whole spectrum behind that, and you have to be pretty severe to sort of actually qualify for those diagnoses. And, I guess I had kind of been aware that what I was doing was not helpful to my long-term health for a while, but you get all of the reinforcers from society, because on the surface of things I was very selective about all of the healthy foods that I was eating. I never drank, I never ate junk food, I was exercising every day. Like, that's the sort of shit that people in your workplace, congratulate you for and celebrate you for, and it's actually just reinforcing, potentially some unhelpful things. But, ultimately I did sort of speak to a sports psychologist and did sort of some work with sort of a sports doctor. But even when I was in front of those people, I wasn't really fully open with them. I, was probably still smart enough to know what to tell them to kind of get them off my back a little bit. And ultimately it was sort of being back in a moon boot the second time round, the third time round, that, really got me sort of having to wake up. And it was actually more podcasts on the issue that started to really open my mind, like hearing other people's story and going, oh shit, I really actually can't hide from this anymore. I love running too much to keep impairing my ability to do that long term, because I just end up broken. And I guess learning to trust my body again, and then really unpacking what it was that was driving me to choose to control my food as a way to get control in my life. And that's going to be very different for everyone. And as I said, not everyone's necessarily ready to really deal with that. And I think it's a process. I'm still unpacking some of that stuff. But, you're definitely not alone. And I'd say 80% of the female athletes I've worked with have had an eating disorder or currently having disordered eating patterns. And it's really, I think, unfortunate that... I do think it's a product of this sort of dieting culture that we've been barraged with, plus a whole bunch of other stresses, and, the way that it's manifesting, we just see it more in runners because we put our body through more stress. But I think it's just as rife in the rest of society. It's just, it's something that I think we just all need to be a bit more aware of and reach out and talk about a bit more.
Absolutely. Thanks for sharing that. Well, I
probably gone way over time. Whatever that even looks like.
There's no time barrier, that's for sure. And if it was up to me, I'd still be chortling here too.
The longest episode. Do it. Settle in. What else can we tackle?
Did you have anything else to cover off, Dom?
No, that's it from me. Yeah.
Well, thanks for coming on the podcast again, and obviously thank you for being an incredible support for me.
No, it's been a pleasure.
I really appreciate it.
It's super fun.
Yeah. Thanks, Sally.
No problem.
Thanks, Sally.
Another episode of With the Chiefs.
Man, I need more rest.
I hope I've got your last name right there.
It's a very good pronunciation.
You should know better than that now, Dom.
I know.